Good day, everybody. A warm welcome on behalf of CDAC to CDAC's 2020 Annual Public Forum. Wherever you are and wherever you're joining, I hope you and yours are safe and well. And we're really thankful for you joining us and taking the time to join us here today. This year's Annual Public Forum will focus on accountability in the age of the algorithm, championing pathways to inclusion in tech-driven futures. My name is Paul Conneally, and I'll be moderating the first two sessions of the forum today. But before we start, I want to open with a few housekeeping notes. Please familiarize yourself with our virtual platform. You'll see the program tab to the left-hand side of the platform as shown in the image on the left of your screen, and you can click on the photograph of any speaker to view a full bio. On the right-hand side, you can view the questions and comments from fellow participants, and this is where we would ask you to put all of your questions and comments during the sessions. We'll be putting your questions to the speakers at the end of each session during the plenary, and we ask that all questions are put here and not directly onto Zoom. We encourage as much social media engagement as possible. Tweet and share about what you hear using the following hashtags and Twitter handles. Hashtag CDAC 2020. You can tag the CDAC network, and of course, CommonAid, which is a byword for our community. So just to remind you that all of the sessions in the forum will be recorded and will be available on CDAC's YouTube channel after the event. And finally, the MYT team, our event organizers, are here to help you with any technical difficulties. Please use the questions and comments facility within the virtual meeting platform to ask any technical questions or email the team directly, where MYT will be standing by to support you directly. Now, back to the real business of the forum. For this event, we have some 40 speakers from across the world, and an audience of over 400 people have registered, coming from 38 different countries. This is clearly a topic that is important and runs deep for many working in the humanitarian world, in national civil society organizations, international development, research, media development organizations, the technology sector, and beyond. CDAC brings together all of these diverse voices and experiences, comprising a network that is passionate about engaging and empowering people and communities affected by disasters and complex crises. I would like to offer a special thank you to CDAC Network's Executive Director, Marion Casey Maslin, and her Secretariat team for inviting me to moderate today's event. I've been involved with CDAC in one way or another since it was established over 10 years ago, and have seen it grow and evolve and become one of the most popular, important leaders, conveners, and advocates for community engagement. To put this event in context, each year the CDAC network holds a meeting of its members, its annual General Assembly, which took place yesterday, as well as this public forum. Yesterday at the annual General Assembly, the chair of CDAC's board, Mr. Jeff Loam, set all of these events in motion with an internal analysis and reflection by members on CDAC's work to enable more effective communication and engagement with people affected by disasters and the various approaches it employs. This included sessions on how the network is adapting its work in the challenging environment of the COVID-19 pandemic, how it assesses performance of the national platform from diverse stakeholder perspectives, and how it can better support its members in a fast-changing world, and other related topics. The final internal session of the CDAC General Assembly will be held at the end of the public forum tomorrow, and will lay the groundwork for development of the new CDAC 5-year strategic plan. CDAC has long sought to influence systems change in the sector and has increasingly focused on humanitarian futures. At this event, the network is excited to convene a space through which some of the leading experts in humanitarian tech futures will be speaking. I really hope you got an opportunity to read Arathi Krishnan's background paper, which quickly points to the current and future challenges in this sector. As someone who has been an advocate for and passionately believed in the power of community engagement throughout much of my career, I found Arathi's paper to be one of the most substantive and thought-provoking on the topic that I've read in recent times. To quote from it, "The responsible and ethical use of emerging technologies within humanitarian systems requires intentional, democratized design with diverse perspectives to ensure that technological futures do not exacerbate past inequalities. Inclusive futures that impact all of us cannot be designed by just a select privileged few." I think that's worth repeating because that really brings together much of what we will be discussing over these 2 days. Inclusive futures that impact all of us cannot be designed by just a select privileged few. So with that in mind, and without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for the first day of the event, Mr. Sabelo Mhlambi. The title of this keynote is "The Future Isn't White, Examining the Current Shifts at the Intersection of Human Rights, Ethics, and Technology." Sabelo Mhlambi is a researcher at the world-renowned Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, and his work focuses on the ethical implications of technology in the developing world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, along with the creation of tools to make artificial intelligence more accessible and inclusive to underrepresented communities. Last year, Sabelo was a Technology and Human Rights Fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy in Harvard University. And Sabelo is also founder of Bantocracy, a tech and tech policy platform focused on Ubuntu ethics. Over to you, Sabelo.
Thank you so much, Paul, for the very generous introduction. It is truly a pleasure to be speaking before all of you, and it is an honor to share just a few thoughts on what the future can look like and why we should desire a different future and a different alternative. The future is not white, and I am here to tell you why that is a good thing. Not only is it a desirable thing that the future is not white, but I believe that this is a future which we should all embrace and a future which we should ensure becomes a reality. I believe that this is especially so in the human rights community, for it is in our shared interest to have a society that does not accord special privileges to whiteness. It is in our interest to ensure that true and widespread rights that affirm human dignity and rights that place humans over profit are everywhere. And I would imagine that this is agreeable and that this is a welcome change that we should all endeavor and strive for, that we should work for a society that does not perpetuate white supremacy in any of its forms. Yes, the future is not white, and it should not be. The future must be one in which we all belong, in which the nature of human rights and of technology used in the human rights field and the technology used in society actually protects the dignity and worth of those who are most marginalized. Now, if any of this should make any of us feel uncomfortable, perhaps it is because I'm inviting each of us to touch and re-examine the central nerve of society, the central nerve within the human rights world, the global economy, and global political order. What I am suggesting to you today and asking from each of us is to consider an idea that seeks to structurally undo and fundamentally transform a way of life that we may have become used to, are familiar with, and comfortable with. I am asking each of us to perhaps sit with a degree of discomfort as the necessary first step to unseating the heartbeat, the foundation, and the background hum of society, which of course is white supremacy. Now, I believe that all of us at our core agree that we do not want a future that gives special status to whiteness. And if we took the opposing position today, I believe that we would find that if we took the opposing position, stating that whiteness, for some reason, due to its own merit or worthiness, deserves special recognition and status, this would be an unpopular position. It would be quite difficult today in the post-colonial world to try to advance such an idea. And equally so, due to the work and to the testimony and experiences of mostly non-white scholars, it may be also unpopular or uncritical to deny the gaps in the outcomes between white and non-white societies, between white families and non-white families, whether in Europe or whether in America. The gaps in wealth, education, and health outcomes disproportionately negatively impact non-white populations. This we know. And these gaps are intricately connected to the very institution of white supremacy. Now, non-white global South scholars have been producing this work for decades, showing these inconsistencies, showing these contradictions. And there has been much work that has been done in the fields of decoloniality and decolonization that makes evident that the legacy of white supremacy still exists today, and that it affects us even today. I would believe that we are aware to some extent that society today does place a premium and a priority on whiteness. It places a premium and priority on the protection and proliferation of whiteness. And we are increasingly aware that this trend is also being reproduced through algorithmic technology. When we recognize technology that is now enforcing biases that tend to disproportionately affect already marginalized populations. Yes, artificial intelligence today is also affirming and protecting the role of white supremacy. Now, if the current status quo, if it is true that it does place a premium on whiteness, and if it is true that we do not want a society, whether now or in the future, that does place a premium on whiteness, then we must have a corresponding duty, and maybe even a desire to remove society's widespread and pervasive premium and preference on whiteness. Now, what does this mean? This means that today we are asked, from now and onward, to actively participate in decolonizing society. We are asked to participate in the decolonial processes. We're asked to participate in decolonizing technology, decolonizing AI, decolonizing the world of human rights, which also means first decolonizing our notions and our understanding of what it even means to be human in the very first place. We must deconstruct and redefine the qualities and aspects that are so significant to achieving human dignity in ways that actually broaden human rights protections. We must examine today, what does it really mean to be human? And what responsibility does that definition place on us? Now, if we go back to early Western philosophy, personhood was defined as fundamentally rational. To be human essentially was to have the ability to be rational. It was claimed by the early philosophers that rationality was that unique characteristic that made us human, and that being rational is sort of an individual activity. So therefore, we were self-sufficient, we were independent. One's rationality was not constrained to the rationality of others. And it was thought that through the power of the mind, the individual could have mastery over nature. And then through this process, achieve self-fulfillment. It was thought that because of rationality, individuals were to be seen as autonomous and self-independent beings. Rational, self-sufficient human beings were the basis of society. And all that was needed for a harmonious society was to have liberty for the individual being, liberty and equality, equality before the law. Not only was this idea pervasive during the Enlightenment era, it influenced the early articulations of human rights, and it centered them on this individualistic orientation. The individual became the central focus of society. Artificial intelligence also borrowed and developed heavily from this early conception of personhood. For in reality, artificial intelligence is truly a quest to create artificial persons. It is a quest to create artificial personhood. These are machines that can either match or surpass human thinking and abilities. And it was assumed that machines, through the rules of logic, through mathematics, could match the certainty that human thinking could provide. Now, this has left us today with the idea that machines are somehow objective, that they're rational, or that they're unbiased. And this all stems from this early philosophy that rationality alone is sufficient, whether in human beings, whether in society, that it alone is sufficient to achieve human aims. Now, such a view, whether it's in the world of technology or in the world of human rights, is fundamentally flawed, and it is broken. It is riddled with contradictions that were always present from the onset and can only lead to more inequality. The so-called achievements of the Enlightenment era were always accompanied by an equally graver side, an underside, grave consequences for non-Europeans. Rationality has always been accompanied by oppression. A focus on the supremacy of the individual has always been accompanied by massive inequality and hypocrisy within Western society. Whether it's the economic structures, capitalism's free markets built on the forced markets of colonialism, political structures, individualism imposed through coloniality, and discriminatory social hierarchies that were justified, racism and sexism justified as institutions embedded in this rationalized social and gender exclusions from full person status. All of these exclusions, all of these contradictions, all of these inequalities in turn shape the data, the creation, and the function of artificial intelligence. So this is all connected. The dominant views that we have today, the dominant conception of human rights, the dominant orientation of artificial intelligence, the prevalence of surveillance capitalism, these are not there because they are the best ideas or that the best ideas won. These systems are not there because they are more fit or worthy in society. These systems are here simply because of a legacy of violence and a legacy of inequality. The European and American thinkers knew this, and they even predicted within their framework of governance and thinking. And they suggested early on that liberty and equality could not both coexist. Now, this definitely presents some problems when we can say that liberty and equality cannot both coexist in the same world. This contention was that a society would always have to choose and decide between liberty or equality, and that if a choice should be made, liberty would always have to win over inequality. In fact, inequality was seen as sort of the necessary price, the necessary precondition for liberty. Now, if some of these early thinkers, Hegel, Alexander Hamilton, and their contemporaries are correct in that inequality is necessary for liberty, then the Human Rights Project, along with technology based on this idea of the rational person, based on the supremacy of rationality, are both undermined from the start and incapable of fully protecting human dignity. The laws and principles that assert individual autonomy and individual supremacy also make it possible for massive inequality. They make it possible for extreme inequality, extreme income inequality. In modern societies, how we experience liberty is often a function of economic power. It's a function of wealth, a function of money. Those with more money essentially have more liberty, more autonomy. And we must ask ourselves, are these the societies that we wish to have now and in the future, where we have different degrees of liberty and autonomy simply based on how much wealth one has. This prophecy has been fulfilled over and over and over again. We have yet to see today societies where liberty and equality both exist. In the United States, a country that has had democracy for a long time, we still find it even hard today, even difficult today, to still fully realize the rights of the Black population. Now, one can wonder that if a nation or society continuously fails for decades, for centuries, in protecting the rights of its most marginalized, is it truly intending to protect the rights? Or is that such a project is already undermined from the start and maybe may not be possible to achieve with the current frameworks that we do have? Now, these are realizations that were made known as early as the 1960s by African writers and other writers across the global South, from Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, who came up with the term neo-colonization, and Walter Rodney of Guyana. They show the problems and the contradictions that came along with this conception of human rights, this conception of being human, and the institutions that develop and come from that conception. Hegel believed this centuries before. Hegel believed that capitalism, for example, could only work in Europe if Europeans colonized other people. Otherwise, Europeans would have to face extreme poverty within Europe. So this is the central point, that the issues behind algorithmic technology, that the issues that prevent current major human rights frameworks from achieving widespread human dignity and protection, that these issues are all interrelated. They stem from the same type of thinking, the same type of philosophy, the same value systems, the same prioritization that ultimately serves the group in power. They ultimately do little to nothing to confront white supremacy, dignity, and worth in ways that are meaningful. And therefore, we must today redefine what it means to be human. And we must take this new conception and imagine a new set of human rights, new governance frameworks, a new technology, new ways of thinking about and using technology in ways that can counter the continued legacy of colonialism that we live in. Now, to an extent, this may be uncomfortable because essentially it is a call to decenter Western narratives and Western perspectives. This is a call in which human rights becomes increasingly defined by those populations who are most vulnerable in society: refugees, immigrants, indigenous people, people in the global South. This is a future in which power is redistributed from its current centralization and even from the current tokenization processes. This is a future in which Western organizations have to go into these communities, into the indigenous communities, into the global South, to begin to find a new sense and inspiration and direction. This is a reality in which the Western world acknowledges that whiteness itself, whiteness as an institution, is the greatest violator of human rights. And we find this idea all across Latin America, all across Sub-Saharan Africa, that whiteness invades our privacy. It does subvert our autonomy. It enters into our minds. It changes how we see ourselves. It shifts how we relate to each other, how we relate to society, how we relate to the environment. And it does so in ways that assert and enforce white supremacy. Our minds become colonized, and our attitudes and beliefs are changed in ways that distort true justice, in ways that make it impossible to actually and effectively achieve equality. Now, all of us play a role in this reality. White and non-white, we all participate, and we play a role in various degrees in this reality. But the facts are evident, and intuitively we do know it, that we all do not benefit from or achieve or experience the same quality of life. We know that there is a massive gap, a gap based on geography, a gap based on economic class, a gap based on social and racial lines. In the United States, we know through the data that white families on average have a wealth gap that is 10 times that of Black families. We know from the data that white high school graduates tend to be wealthier than Black college graduates. But we are often told that if communities become more rational, if communities become more productive, if they work more, if they work harder, if communities become more rights oriented, if they respect human rights, that the gaps will narrow. We're told that if societies use more artificial intelligence, poverty can be addressed, that biases can be eliminated. In some cases, we're told that if African nations are more human rights oriented, that poverty would be minimized. Yet there is no correlation between such human rights frameworks based on the supremacy of the individual with actual economic outcomes. And there is no correlation to using artificial intelligence that it actually does reduce poverty or that it does increase equality in society. And in fact, the evidence now increasingly suggests that the inverse may actually be true, that these ideologies actually create and sustain poverty. They create and sustain inequality. We may be sensitive to the idea that we must decenter the North, decenter these Western dominant narratives. And we may find that the redistribution of wealth, of power, of status as an offensive, or maybe even a leftist idea, socialist or communist idea. That there must be other ways where marginalized populations can climb out of their oppression. That we can find ways to narrow the gap without looking at policies that seek to redistribute power. But that is impossible. We cannot simply bridge the gap that has been created by centuries of oppression, by centuries of colonial attitudes. The gap that has been created can never be filled, can never be achieved in any other way. We cannot work ourselves up to fill this gap. We cannot respect more rights to fill this gap. This gap was artificially created, and this gap needs to be reduced. But the solutions which we may be looking at may be the wrong solutions. Maybe we need to find other alternatives that inform us and that give us a framework on how to properly redistribute power. There must be a process of decentering. There must be a process of decolonizing. There must be a process of creating a future that isn't white like the past, but a future in which we can all belong. Now, there are many robust frameworks for doing so that we can find across the Global South. There are frameworks of doing so that we can find across indigenous communities. And Ubuntu is one such framework. It is a framework that comes from South Africa. Ubuntu itself, in its etymology, it talks about human dignity, the process of being human, and it centers on restoration and reconciliation. One thing that is lacking in the conversations that we have today is that the process of narrowing the gap, narrowing the inequalities, is that marginalized populations have to do the work to narrow this gap. But we rarely talk about restoration, about reconciliation, about redistributing the wealth, redistributing power. But we need to start imagining or finding frameworks that allow us to have this language, that allow us to not only work to prevent harm or to do no evil or to do no harm, but we need frameworks that also give us the tools and the ability to actually repair harm, the tools to actually fix harm. When harm is being done, we need to have frameworks and ways to fix that harm, frameworks that can actually bridge the gap. We need frameworks that see the human as not just purely rational or just purely an individual. We need to have frameworks that encourage society to play an active role in the life of the individual. The African Charter on Human and People's Rights, for example, is the only legally binding international document, legislation that does incorporate the third wave of human rights. There are various attempts to try to include more rights, to extend human rights frameworks, to make it more encompassing in order to protect the rights of all. And so we need to find such instruments and such frameworks and find ways in which we can incorporate these ideas that may decenter Western dominant narratives. The solutions are there, but we must understand that they are no longer the exclusive property or the exclusive domain of the Western world. And this is the way it must be. In order to truly achieve a world in which human rights are felt and experienced by even the most marginalized, we have a duty. We have a duty to expand human rights. We have a duty to confront the contradictions. We have a duty to confront the reality that we have today. We each have a responsibility to decenter Western and white narratives and realize that the world is much, 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 much more diverse than how the lenses of colonialism and capitalism have viewed it. So it is our duty, therefore, today to ensure that the future does belong to us. It is our duty to ensure that the future belongs to every single human being. And it is up to us to ensure that the future isn't white. It is up to us to do the work of redistributing power, to do the work of bridging the gap, to do the work of reimagining societies, reimagining economies, reimagining social hierarchies, reimagining the redistribution of wealth, economic power, status in such a way that the rights of those who are most marginalized can be affirmed. And once we begin to do this, whether in the human rights field, whether in the field of technology, or any other institution in society, we can then only begin to realize true equality, true human dignity, and true human worth. But it becomes impossible for us to reach such a state if we don't confront the main core inconsistencies, the main contradictions that prevent such work to be done. And in order to allow for such work to be done, we have to decenter ourselves from the dominant narratives, from patriarchy, from different Western concepts that stem from this idea, from this idea that is often stated in different ways, but this idea that is often really the weaponization of rationality. We need to truly begin to understand and to really envision and to redefine what it means to be human, and to realize that we are not just individuals who are self-complete, who can achieve all our aims purely by ourselves. We need to realize that such a view, such an understanding, such a conception of the world actually creates inequality, it actually leads to inequality, and that the inequality we have today is not by accident, it's not by chance, it is by design. And it stems from a particular type of thinking, a particular way of viewing the world. And we can have a different world today. We can work towards a different world. We can work towards a better future. We can work towards a more diverse and more encompassing future if we begin the work today and onwards to bring in other perspectives, to redefine what it means to be human, and to find frameworks that allow us to see the human being as part of society, a human being that is owed by society the chance to achieve human dignity and human worth. It is up to us to ensure that the future isn't just white. Thank you.
Sabelo, thank you so much. That was a really great opening keynote for the CDAC Public Forum, extremely thought-provoking. Can't wait to invite you back to the plenary just after 1 p.m. UK time today, where we already have a number of questions coming in from participants who are really eager to probe your thoughts even more, but really good opening keynote. Lots of food for thought there around reimagining human rights and confronting the contradictions that are inherent in our institutions and societies. So thank you so much, Sabelo, and an extra thanks for being with us, because I know it's an ungodly hour in the morning where you are, around 4 a.m. So we're hugely appreciative of you joining us. And see you again at the plenary. So we're now moving on to the first theme of the forum, algorithms and accountability, with the intriguing title, Prediction Cloudy with Silver Linings, to be presented by Emily Dwyer and Laura Carter. So I'm really looking forward to this session. We're going to look at the impact of algorithms on people with diverse sexual orientation, gender identity and/or expression, and sex characteristics. So Emily is the co-director of Edge Effect and Gender and data consultant and Cambridge PhD candidate Laura Carter. Emily and Laura, you have the virtual floor.
Thank you very much, and greetings to everyone around the world, wherever you are joining us. Greetings from myself, Emily Dwyer, and my co-host, Laura Carter. Joining you today, at least I am, from Melbourne, just outside of Melbourne, on the land of the Dungurung people of the Kulin Nation, land that was never ceded, and acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging. We're very conscious that this session, Prediction, Cloudy with Silver Linings, is part of the first session of this conference, and we really hope that this brief presentation opens up a series of issues that will be carried forward in different ways over the following sessions, and indeed, hopefully builds on ideas that were in the keynote, and thank you so much for that really provoking beginning to the conference. We're going to be raising two sets of issues within the first sort of cloudy or grey cloud section of the presentation. Firstly, that artificial intelligence systems may indeed reinforce the invisibility of LGBTIQ+ people when invisibility is the problem, but simultaneously may also heighten visibility of LGBTIQ people when that visibility is a problem. But there are silver linings, and amongst them is the potential for us to reframe and use the concept and politics of data justice. And that's an awful lot for 10 minutes, and so we're going to jump right in. There is a growing body of evidence that LGBTIQ people, or people of diverse sexual orientations, gender identities and expression and sex characteristics, or diverse SOGIESC, have specific needs in humanitarian crises. However, these needs often go unaddressed by humanitarian actors. This is not usually because of malice, but more because of factors including invisibility. And the invisibility of LGBTIQ people in humanitarian response has at least two main sources. First being absence from or absence in data, and secondly, exclusionary norms. Humanitarian assessments and other data sets often provide little or no insight into the lives of people with diverse sexual orientation, gender identity, expression, and sex characteristics. For example, the post-disaster needs assessment, one of the documents there for Tropical Cyclone Winston, mentions sexual orientation twice. And the second of two mentions was a footnote stating no information was available on issues related to sexual orientation. And this is certainly not an outlier in the humanitarian sector. Indeed, the UN Special Expert on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity has written a whole report about the invisibility of LGBTIQ people in humanitarian and development sector data. Being visible, however, is not necessarily the same thing as being identified or being counted individually, which of course could raise protection issues. It's more about the nature of our experiences being recognised, and the data that reveals those experiences is often in the form of stories or other kinds of qualitative data. Our experiences are far less likely to feature in large data sets with all kinds of indicators generated through surveys, APIs, or scraping. But it's those larger data sets that are often of greater interest to AI. Indeed, as we present this session, there's a Humanitarian AI competition open to applications, and we explored putting in a proposal, but to do so, you sort of need to have a big data set. And as far as we know, there are no big data sets that include meaningful data about sexual orientation or gender identity as a factor in humanitarian and development problems. And if we're not in the data, the consequence is that we're not in the analysis. Of course, LGBTIQ people or people with diverse SOGIESC have all kinds of characteristics, as well as those linked to their sexual orientation, gender identity, and their sex characteristics. And so predictive analysis or other forms of AI that use non-inclusive data sets may indeed provide signals that reflect aspects of our experiences. But it's also just as possible that the systemic discrimination experienced by LGBTIQ people in all aspects of their lives and in pre-emergency contexts may mean that our motivations in crises are different, that the resources that we're drawing upon in crises are different, that the risks that we're mitigating in our lives are different. And so we might make different choices. We might stay in damaged houses because we don't feel welcome in evacuation centres, or we might go to urban centres and not camps, just to mention two examples. And so AI, which is driven by data and the analysis and solutions that come out of that, may work for us, but also they may not work for us. Laura.
A second driver of LGBTIQ plus exclusion in humanitarian activity is the prevalence of exclusionary norms. So on the next slide, we've got the top results of an image search for the term family drawing. And these images reveal various biases. And one in particular is this assumption that families are based around a heterosexual relationship between a woman and a man. And this is an example of heteronormativity, which is one of 4 norms that underpin discrimination against LGBTIQ plus people. These norms don't automatically imply malice towards LGBTIQ plus people or their relationships or their lives. They may just direct attention towards some people and in the process render other people invisible. But in some countries and contexts, however, heteronormativity and other exclusionary norms are reflected in laws or policies or institutions or culture, and they're policed by officials and civilians alike. So when we float this idea of society in the loop as a way to tame excesses or problems with AI, we need to consider what happens if that society would prefer to see you locked up or prefer to see you undergoing conversion therapy. Researchers have shown how norms around race, for example, can be entrenched in AI systems. So we can look, for example, at Sophia Noble's work, which has documented how Google's proprietary search algorithms reinforce racism. We can look at the documentation done by ProPublica of the Compass predictive software that was used in sentencing processes in the US, which has been shown to overestimate the likelihood of reoffending for Black people and underestimate the likelihood for white people. In July of this year, an online service that was called Genderify was launched, and this service promised to use AI technologies to predict the gender of an individual based only on the information provided, their name or maybe their email address. It worked poorly, but as researchers like Oz Keys have noted, automated systems that claim to recognize gender in this way reinforce the idea that gender is binary. It reinforces the idea that non-binary and gender non-conforming people are outliers who don't need to be included. And so we need to think about when humanitarian AI systems are commissioned or designed or operated, will norms that exclude LGBTIQ plus people be built into modeling assumptions, or will they be reinforced through the choice of training data? To return to our previous example, will AI systems take into account families that have a same-sex relationship at their core, for example? Will they take into account what LGBTIQ plus people call their chosen family, where people who are ostracized from their birth families form units that function for all intents and purposes as families? So far we've focused on the invisibility of LGBTIQ plus people when we need to be visible. But what about visibility when we need to be invisible? Sometimes LGBTIQ plus people are actively targeted by state security forces, by other armed groups, or by civilians. We may live with the fear of being outed by a careless comment, or we may approach, for example, a checkpoint with trepidation, holding identification documents that don't match our gender identity. AI systems have several capabilities that make it more likely that LGBTIQ plus people will be identified without their consent and against their interests. LGBTIQ plus people in some countries are incredibly careful about digital traces that they leave. But we all make mistakes, and sometimes our data is collected in the absence of choice or consent. And as more data sets are brought into analysis, triangulation increases the risks for LGBTIQ plus people. Facial recognition and biometric technologies present other risks as well. In 2018, researchers at Stanford University in the USA reported that they had built a classification algorithm using neural networks that identified facial features that could predict heterosexuality or homosexuality to more than 80% accuracy. The study was based only on photos of white people in the US that were uploaded to a data site that wasn't named in the paper. Nevertheless, the researchers argued that their methods could be generalized. And so in countries where there is extensive social stigma or criminalization, this kind of technology adds a tool for those who would seek to prove that a person is gay in order to abuse them with impunity. Biometric technology also has the potential to out transgender people. If, for example, an algorithm flags a gender that does not match with an individual's presentation or their documentation. Full body scanners used at many international airports require the operator to press a blue or a pink button, depending on whether they think the passenger is male or female. But if a scanner detects unexpected body parts, the passenger is referred to intensive screening. And in some cases, that's resulted in trans people being forced to show their genitals to security officers to prove that they're not a threat. And the threat to LGBTIQ+ people whose identities are revealed is not theoretical. Suspected lesbians have been subjected to what has been termed corrective rape. LGBTIQ+ people have been targeted during conflict as part of moral cleansing exercises. So as AI becomes cheaper and as it's deployed by a wider range of actors, humanitarian agencies need to be aware of the increased risk for LGBTIQ+ people. Back to you, Emily.
Thanks, Laura. So far we've looked at situations where invisibility is a bad thing and can be reinforced, and where visibility is a bad thing and can also be reinforced. But we did promise you some silver linings. So there are opportunities for humanitarian AI to positively influence the lives of LGBTIQ people. So, for example, to track and respond to hate speech, such as this example from social media in Indonesia. The blaming of LGBTIQ+ people for causing disasters is a common occurrence, often proposed as divine punishment for our sins, as in the case in this example in Indonesia. There are also codes, such as the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative Signal Code, that seek to address potential bias in artificial intelligence systems and to expose the workings of those systems to rights-based scrutiny and participation. Data management guidelines, such as those put forward in documentation by the ICRC, include some guidance on diverse SOGIESC issues as well. And these and other measures may be effective in minimising harm. But potentially there is a bolder step. The emergence of data justice and data feminism recognise the liberatory and emancipatory power of data when it is used in ways that challenge oppression. Now, operationalising concepts like data justice is going to require much deeper engagement with LGBTIQ people, to treat them not merely as sources of data or sources of even of ethical dilemmas at online conferences, but to work with them to ask why data is being collected or not, how it's being collected, what use is going to be made of that data, what stories are being told or reinforced, by whom, and for whose benefit. And I've included a photo here of Abigail Hawke, a First Nations health researcher whose writing on decolonising data has certainly influenced us. So we could choose this moment to challenge business as usual, to share power with marginalised groups as they navigate the world. And indeed, the pre-emergency systemic marginalisation of people with diverse SOGIESC also leads to strengths within the same communities, strengths within informal networks, and a different framing of data and artificial intelligence might provide opportunities for those strengths to be amplified. So I guess there's a question here now. Over the next 2 days, are we going to amplify harms? Are we going to minimise harms? Or possibly even stage a revolution? It's in your hands, and thank you.
Thank you, Emily and Laura, so much. People with diverse SOGIESC, sexual orientation, gender identity and/or expression and sex characteristics have long been neglected by traditional humanitarian actors. So we're delighted that we've been able, in our own small way today, to address this in the first day of the CDAC Public Forum. We will be hearing more from both Emily and Laura in the plenary session, which is due to start at around 10 minutes after 1 o'clock UK time. But also I'd like to remind you before we move on, I'd like to remind you to please use the questions and comments panel on the right-hand side of your screen, where you can put questions to all of the speakers that you'll be following here today in the CDAC Public Forum. But before we go to the plenary session, we're going to press on with the focus of this theme, a panel discussion organized by the Humanitarian Policy Group at ODI, the Overseas Development Institute, with the title, The Humanitarian Digital Divide. The panel will be led and moderated by the ODI's Oliver Luff, who is a research fellow at the Humanitarian Policy Group. Ollie, take it away.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you also to Sabelo and to Emily and Laura for some really fascinating presentations. I am going to just set the scene very briefly before we dive into this conversation, just to go over some of the key issues that we're going to be talking about here. So digital technology has really had a fundamental change on the humanitarian sector over the past decade, and it's had major impacts on both how aid is delivered and the form that it takes. Sometimes this has been hugely beneficial both to affected populations and to the humanitarian actors that are trying to serve them. So, for example, we've seen a shift from cumbersome and poorly targeted food and non-food item distributions being replaced by money delivered directly to people's phones to be spent as they wish. We've also seen advances in GIS and digital data collection, providing people, humanitarians especially, with larger amounts of information about affected populations much more quickly than was previously possible. But on the reverse, digital technology has also been used increasingly in more sinister ways in the sector. So it's being used to gatekeep. Algorithms are being used to make decisions without necessarily having safety nets of accountability in place. At its most extreme, technology has been used to facilitate what is essentially experimentation on some of the world's most vulnerable populations. And these dynamics are coming together to risk forming a complex that Mark Latanaro has called surveillance humanitarianism. So against this background, the question of whether digital technology is supporting or eroding inclusion and participation in humanitarian action is very much an open one. We've been doing a bit of research on how technology is being used by humanitarians in the COVID-19 pandemic, and understandably, a lot of these questions are sharpening. There's definitely a lot more interest in technical solutions to maintain continuity of services during lockdowns and social distancing measures. And in some cases, this has actually been a really good thing. So we've spoken to one interview at a big UN agency about how they have been looking at fundamentally changing and reprioritizing how they deal with social media. They are shifting from churning out PR and one-way messaging to two-way communications that is trying to meet people where they are on the platforms they're comfortable with, which is pretty scary for them because it involves letting go of control and exposing themselves to a much higher degree of uncertainty than normal. There's also evidence that there's an increasing realization among some humanitarian agencies that they can't go it alone in delivering technology-driven solutions in humanitarian action, and that they need to think really seriously and in a principled way about how they can better engage in a more networked way with governments, with tech companies, and right down to local journalists and Indigenous activists. At the same time, though, there's also a risk that the COVID-19 pandemic and the tech solutions that are accompanying it could exacerbate digital divides. So access is a major issue here. If you're going to rapidly attempt to expand digital services, people without a phone and people without money to pay for data are not going to be able to take part. So recent GSMA research has shown that in vulnerable and marginalized communities often have less access to technology than their peers. And if practitioners ignore this divide, then that exclusion will be exacerbated. But the other side of the coin is not just access, but use and people having the skills to use technology safely and effectively. And this is often overlooked. One of our interviewees has flagged that they're concerned that digital literacy programming is still not really seen as glamorous enough by some donors or some technology companies that are still focused on pushing solutions that are focused on apps and on hardware rather than the people who are actually using them. So we've already seen the fallout from this in the Greek refugee response from a few years ago, where a lot of well-meaning top-down tech solutions just led to so much what's been called digital litter. So dead apps, dead links, things that just didn't really work for the people they were trying to help. And this sort of raises a really important point, that without actually including affected populations in designing and choosing the tech solutions that are trying to help them, there's a great risk that you end up with wasteful, irrelevant, and potentially even dangerous solutions that don't actually serve their needs effectively. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our panel, who are going to discuss these issues in a lot more depth. Adelina Kamal is the Executive Director of the ASEAN Coordination Center for Humanitarian Assistance on Disaster Management, which she leads in facilitating ASEAN's collective responses to major disasters. Dragana Karin is the Executive Director of Localization Lab, which works to strengthen internet access and the presence of underrepresented communities around the world on the web by translating and localizing internet freedom tools. Rob Trigwell works with the International Organization for Migration's Displacement Tracking Matrix, where he coordinates a research team focusing on the application of emerging technologies within the humanitarian sector. I'd like to start with a question to Rob. You've been looking at a lot of the issues around how technology can affect power imbalances between aid providers and affected people. Can you tell us a bit about what you're seeing?
Yeah, good afternoon all, and many thanks for inviting me to participate today. It was, yeah, there was some really powerful opening remarks, so it's a pleasure to be part. Yeah, thanks, Oliver. So from kind of my own experience in working in different humanitarian contexts, the humanitarian sector is a network of relationships, and with multiple different tiers, and so are the potential power imbalances when we speak about kind of leveraging emerging technologies. Just to put on some examples that you've just mentioned in just the last few minutes, the access to technology, for example, the impact it may have on the affected population's household. For example, mobile phone ownership is somewhat, you know, you may have 5 people in a household in the UK, and it might be fairly safe to assume that there's 5 people owning mobile phones, but in a lot of the context, the ownership of mobile phones is somewhat of a privilege. So if there is a program such as the example to do with cash program sent to phones, or SMS feedback mechanisms that you've also mentioned, then really a power imbalance can come from really who has the mobile phone. Is it in a lot of kind of humanitarian context, could it be maybe the elder male in the household that has access to the phone, that can give the feedback, can have access to the service then? Or is it the social media program, the crowdsourcing analytics that maybe also target maybe a different demographic in the household from who might be given that kind of certain type of information? There's also a potential, another tier is between the humanitarian community, the service providers, and the actual affected populations. A lot of humanitarian operations work through registration activities, and registration activities are not always, but can be facilitated by the use of biometrics for a number of different reasons. And then this opens up discussions about how we should operate using biometrics when it on the vulnerable populations we're trying to support. Does it endanger people by forcing them to turn over data to engage in a technology that they may believe exposed risks that was also mentioned today, or people that may not understand the workings behind the system, or if they do not, or does it give an element of feel that if they do not engage with the technology, such as iris scanning or whatnot, then they may be excluded from the aid program that the humanitarian service provider is trying to give, and that really kind of then goes into the area of consent, and, you know, is that truly consenting or not, or dissenting? And then lastly, another kind of potential imbalance of the power could come from the government, could come to access to the resources. For example, who has the resources? Is it the national governments? Is it the international? Is it the international humanitarian community, or is it the local NGOs, the local civil societies? And if one of the entities has the access to the resources, has the access to the technologies, and the others don't, then how does that create this power imbalance? And going back to what I said, it's all about the relationships between going up and going vertical and horizontal, and really the ownership of the resources and the access to the resources can affect the humanitarian landscape in multiple different stratifications.
Thanks very much, Rob. I just wanted to pick up on that point you made about the way that technology can sort of mediate relationships between affected populations and aid providers. And one of the things that comes up time and time again when looking at this relationship more widely is the question of trust, how that flows in both directions. Dragana, this is something I know you've worked on a lot. What role does trust play in sort of determining the success or the failure of humanitarian tech initiatives?
Thank you, Ollie. Thank you so much for having me. Trust is critical for effective engagement, and it has to be seen as a part of a larger accountability to beneficiaries, to people who we're working for. And there's a lot of space in this sector to improve there. That was diplomatically said, obviously. There's a lot of space to, I think, to reimagine how this can be done, to provide better services and aid that actually meets people's needs, because oftentimes what we end up providing for people is things that we think work well, or things that advance our careers because we think that they work well. A very extreme example would be the World Food Program and Palantir partnership, that a lot of people who I've interviewed oftentimes work with refugees and other vulnerable communities, who tell me this is the same company that works with ICE, with immigration and customs enforcement in the US, who looks for people to kick them out of the country. So how is World Food Program, the country that you're relying on for food, for nutrition, for school programs, the same organization that's working with the same company that's kicking other people out in a different country? This also manifests itself in research. One of the folks I've interviewed looked at, he was searching for data that was available on cash programs in Lebanon, and found a heat map of how they were being used around the country, and found what he thought was his line where he was moving around in the countryside. So what he thought was, well, this isn't personally identifiable data, but to whom? How this manifests itself, to echo Laura and Emily, that these are some very exclusionary norms, also in humanitarian aid in general, that people are assumed to somehow be too unable and too stupid to participate in solutions themselves. So what ends up happening is having programs like the IKEA shelter, or apps designed to help refugees communicate safely, that no one ever uses. The result is, in refugee context, is during interviews, the most important interviews for asylum, this is in EU where I did research, people don't give the most important parts of the information to the interviewer. So they skip out on talking about witnessing war crimes, crimes against humanity, experiencing torture, experiencing sexual violence, because it's no longer somebody writing with a pen and paper, it's somebody typing on a keyboard, and they're not explaining to you who this information is shared with, where it's stored, how somebody might be able to access it, who it might be shared with down the line. So people are skeptical. In a couple of cases, even when they were told, you need to tell this part in order to get asylum, they still won't say it. And that last part, I think, is really critical here, that we don't even tell people, here are the things that would get you asylum, but just assume that, tell us your story and we'll see whether it fits in. And so biometrics is obviously a very extreme example, because you can't change biometrics. Once it's taken, it's taken. Oftentimes one person explained to me that he's never seen a machine like this before, and he thought somebody was trying to burn his hand. So I'm just really trying to illustrate that this sector, I think, the undercurrent is that you should be grateful for what comes to you. And so I think so often consent is skipped over, and at the very basic sort of information, where consent is really not possible, people are owed information to be able to control what comes out of a program like this, to be able to be given some agency over what's happening to them. And to echo Sabelo's comments, affected people need to be included in programs like this to be able to provide safe and usable programs that work, instead of something that's going to end up being more dangerous. But this is useless if we're following sort of neo-colonial, neoliberal ideology underneath.
Thanks, Dragana. Yeah, I feel that classic example of the WFP Palantir collaboration sort of can highlight some of the sort of very cozy and very exclusionary relationships that can exist even within the sector, that are very top down and can cut out some of the expertise in the global south, for example. Adelina, just turning to you, like, how are these power imbalances within the sector being reflected from where you're sitting, especially when it comes to technology?
Thank you very much, Oliver, and thank you for inviting the AHA Center to participate in this forum. It has been exciting just to listen to you guys. So it's I cannot wait to express also my thoughts and share my opinions. First of all, the way I say it, the traditional top-down approach in the humanitarian sector when it comes to technology has been that external assistance coming from the outside, going into the disaster-affected country, offering more advanced technology with an assumption that such a technology is not even available in the disaster-affected country. Plus, with the worst assumption that the country has collapsed, the government is not functioning, and the basic infrastructure is weak. That has to change. Why? I come from Southeast Asian region, and this is a region of supermarket of disasters. We have everything except perhaps snow avalanche. We don't have that. We have been the recipient of goodwill from the humanitarian and aid sector for the past decades. So we have witnessed the so-called top-down approach extensively, and this indicates a failure of the humanitarian sector to understand the context of the disaster-affected countries. However, ASEAN region, Southeast Asia, is also a region that is projected to become the fourth largest economy in the world by the year 2030, or 10 years from now. Countries who used to be recipient of disasters like Indonesia, my country, or the Philippines, now already shifted their gear. Indonesia has just set up the Indonesian aid. The Philippines, while they were still recovering from Typhoon Mangkhut in 2018, they provided fresh funds to Indonesia through my organization, AHA Center, to help build an ASEAN village in Central Sulawesi province of Indonesia. So the notion of the disaster-affected countries having no capacity, not knowing what the technology is, not knowing what the problems are, I think will have to change. Now, I'm going to join the first speaker. And I would have to say that the future of disaster management is not going to be all white. It's going to be colorful. I can assure you that. Why? Because at least from our region, the 10 countries of ASEAN back in 2015 have embarked on an ambitious vision to become the global leader on disaster management by the year 2025. And that is 5 years from now. Why? Because we want to change the mentality of being the recipient of aid into a region that share our knowledge responding and recovering from disaster in the past decades. And that has to come from us. That has to come from the region. We want to change the gravity and the center of discussion, shifted that from New York and Geneva to where the disasters are. Because the best experience is actually from going through the experience itself. The best teacher is actually from the experience itself. So In the case of ASEAN, even the three most catastrophic disasters that we have experienced, the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, the wake-up call, the 2008 Cyclone Nargis in Myanmar, the 2013 Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, the governments were still intact. The government may be overwhelmed, but the capital was still functioning. And there were resources from within the country, individuals, neighboring provinces, private sector pouring into the affected area. As an example, the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami affected Aceh province of Indonesia. It's just a province within the big island of Sumatra, as well as one island, small island, Nias. But these are just 2 out of the 17,000 islands in Indonesia. And the neighboring provinces were not affected. And 2 weeks after the tsunami, even the president of Indonesia called for a special ASEAN summit, whereby the Kofi Annan UN Secretary General of that time and the ASEAN leaders got together and asserted the leadership of the Indonesian government in the response and recovery effort. In the case of triple disaster in Central Sulawesi of Indonesia in 2018, we witnessed responders with superhero mentality coming to our country from other parts of the world, bringing search and rescue dogs, bringing big guns, bringing drones and satellite phones. They got turned down by the government of Indonesia. Why? Because what they offer was not within the priority of the government of Indonesia. You imagine a country of 250 million people. Our search and rescue agency has been certified as a medium-level USAR by the INSARAG. We're also one of the G20 countries. So traditionally, this humanitarian digital divide and humanitarian sector, these are all intertwined. These are all connected. The success factor has to change. You are considered as successful when you come to the country faster than the others and flashing your flags. And then you go out when the attention is not there anymore. This has to change. Gone are the days when international assistance coming to a disaster-affected country, at least in our parts of the region. Thank you.
Thanks, Adelina. So I think it's clear from all of the panelists that there is definitely space for the traditional top-down approach to go, and for a much greater degree of humbleness among people who are being, parachuted into help. And that there needs to be maybe more work on thinking about what people's complementary roles are in terms of how they can support each other. So just aware that we're slightly running over time, I'm going to ask each of the panelists in no more than 2 minutes to sort of think about what some of the solutions are here. So how can different actors in the humanitarian sector work together in more complementary ways to make sure that technology supports genuinely more inclusive humanitarian work? Rob, let's start with you.
Thanks, Ollie, and everyone else who has spoken so far. Yeah, I mean, in terms of building trust, particularly with certain technologies, and this is how is through transparent standards. The humanitarian community, for a lot of the traditional, should we say, humanitarian programs of shelter, wash, etc., use common agreed upon standards developed by the humanitarian community for the humanitarian community, for example, called the sphere standards. So if you're building latrines in displacement sites, there's an agreed upon standard of how many latrines you need per person, and these are applicable whether you're operating in Cox's Bazar or if you're operating in areas of South Sudan. And for the digital activities, whether it's the use of biometrics, the use of drones, the use of using call detail records to understand mobility flows, the use of AI, etc., whatever any of the emerging technologies we see, there's a real gap on these interagency standards. Too often or not, the AI discussion gets pushed down the data protection corridor. A lot of agencies have data protection guidelines, they've developed them themselves. But what is really lacking is this interagency and interdisciplinary standards on how to adopt new technologies. And obviously critical is the alignment of making sure that these guidelines are also aligned with national policies. So if there's a national AI policy or if there's a regional AI policy, then obviously all the standards, you have to translate, say, the humanitarian interagency standards to fit to the national regional policies that we're working in. And if everyone knows the middle ground, sorry, the bottom line that we're playing, and if everyone knows the red flags, when we should deploy a technology and when we should not deploy a technology, when it's clear, when it's really clear of how we should go about, and if we've all agreed upon that this is when we'll use it and this is when we're not. Too often or not, we see technology being the technology being employed without a thorough problem recognition process going on, and then we search for the solution, and it may be tech and it may be not. But if we have agreed upon standards that are aligned with, as I say, national regional strategies, then it's transparent, and then people can understand how these technologies are used, deployed, implemented, with full transparency, and that is the way to build trust.
Thanks, Rob. Adelina, what can we do to avoid these solutions in search of problems, as Rob's put it?
Well, in our case, the issue is often not about technology or resources, but whether the people, the policy, and the system and the process in the country are able to mobilize all the required assets and capacities in a speedy and targeted manner to help the affected people. Technology shall be used as the enabler rather than the aim for assistance. Three things to create an enabling environment. First, create resilience, not reliance. I have experienced this quite often when we are offered with technology, but there is actually something, hidden in that offer. I would call it economic rent. Let's be honest about it. When you offer something to the recipient, do you expect that they will be coming back to you for maintenance and upgrading because you're the only one who can operate that technology? Creating reliance is dangerous, but because when you actually go out, the recipient will collapse and the digital divide will even be wider. Second, consider the local capacities and needs. Assess the coping capacities of the countries first. See if the country has really collapsed, if the government is functioning, and if the basic infrastructure is there. When it comes to disaster, the fastest assistance will be coming from inside the country. So see what the resources and capacities available in the country. They may not be within the government, but they can be within the private sector, the academy, the local NGOs, the university, and see how we can help them, because why? They have better understanding and knowledge of the local context and needs. Third, agree on the finish line and move out. After that, move out and move on. When providing technology or training or assistance, there has to be a clear finish line agreed by both sides. When the finish line is reached, then we should, as the one providing the aid, move out and move on. The success factor should be that whatever that we invest or deliver can be continued and sustainable by the recipient. The success factor should be for us to create the leaders that can be the leaders so that they can lead and continue the assistance already provided in the way suitable to the local context and needs. So 3 coming from me. Thank you.
Thanks, Adelina. And Dragana, last word to you. We've talked about sort of standards, we've talked about systems and policies. What about sort of making sure that technology really is working for affected people themselves?
Thank you. Adeline, we were all clapping on this, on resilience, not reliance. How do you top that? That was a great comment. I know we have 2 minutes to get through this, but a few years ago, I interviewed a young refugee from Somalia who arrived in Europe around biometric, how he feels about biometric practices, with scope. And so it's not just international organizations, it's also humanitarian organizations and governments using biometrics for aid and for participating in these systems for cash, for asylum. He told me that he had to go through the UNHCR website to get to the data protection handbook that was not available in Somali, that was only available in English, to get through some page where he found out that he could complain to some. It was, not to get too specific, but why is this not available more easily to somebody who is going through a process like this? It seems so simple. We need a new humanitarian principle in addition to impartiality, neutrality, to do no harm. We need a principle of nothing about us without us. It has to be a participatory approach to everything. And for that, the entire system needs to be challenged, because we can't go on creating programs for people and keep talking about people as if they're not in the room. A second point here is localization of aid. We're living in a time where we're meeting for conferences digitally, right? This is going to happen for a long time, where a lot of programs have been pulled from quote unquote the field or field offices and run more locally. Expertise is local. The future shouldn't look like having a retired CEO from Switzerland come over and run a country office in somewhere where he's never been before, because that's the standard still, and it shouldn't be. People who are going through this experience are the experts in their own emergency, and they need to be treated as such and provided with resources and training and the money and power to make decisions, instead of people who look like me, people who work in this field out of choice. Second, sorry, one more quick point on the participatory design process. I think oftentimes I've seen that what's called participatory design, or taking the bottom-up approach of getting a diverse group of people together to decide on how to reimagine employment systems for refugees, how to reimagine education, the asylum process, what oftentimes, or shelter. What oftentimes happens is that at the very last stage, a group of people are brought together, refugees are brought together to almost approve of a system as feedback, not from early concept stages. This has improved over the past few years, definitely, but it's still the norm to not ask whatsoever, or this sort of performative participatory process where things have already been decided, things have already taken one direction, and sort of to get the last stamp of approval and to sort of cover our bases so we don't get criticized afterwards, we'll bring in people to get feedback, and that's not meaningful participation.
Thanks, Dragana. I think that's a fantastic point to end on what really is meaningful participation, and if we wouldn't accept it in northern countries, why do we expect it to fly in humanitarian contexts? I'm going to hand over to Paul. Thank you so much to all of our panelists, to Rob, to Adelina and Dragana for these really fascinating insights, and I'm hoping that this can spark a provocative discussion.
Thank you very much, Ali, and to all the panelists. Really a lot of fantastic food for thought there. And I think, yes, Adelina's phrase has resonated with a lot of us. It might be the theme to, or the catchphrase to sum up the CDAC Public Forum today: resilience, not reliance. Really, really powerful stuff. A lot of common narrative running through there around partnering at the local level, really using local capacity and understanding local needs when working with communities and working in complex disasters. If Sabelo has rejoined us and the other panelists also, I'd really love to tap into something that you mentioned, Sabelo, in your keynote speech, your opening keynote, and that was really around what it means to be human. I'd like to frame this discussion around that, because I think it's very, very relevant, not just in terms of reimagining how we work as a humanitarian sector, reimagining our relationship with technology, reimagining, flipping the model as it is today to something much more grassroots and community-based, and as you've mentioned, the global south. So I'd love to hear more and maybe also referring to the Ubuntu ethics that you just lightly touched upon before we bring in the other colleagues. And also just to mention, there's questions and comments on the right-hand side for people to ask their questions. Please feel free to do so. And as there are a good few speakers in the group, please don't wait for me to call on you. If you want to jump in, please do, and I'll do my best to moderate it and get us finished up in about 20-25 minutes. So Sabelo, if you're on, I'd love to hear more about what it means to be human.
Thank you, Paul. That's definitely a great question. What it means to be human. So this has been defined differently, of course, in different societies. And if I can speak from the Ubuntu perspective, what it means to be human is sort of transforming and going beyond this purely rational, purely individualistic self, and seeing the individual sort of become more of a communal being, becoming more of a social being, a connected being. And this is the idea that we're all interconnected, right? In ways that we cannot even fully express sometimes. And this is especially even more true now with technology, with artificial intelligence, where you can take a data set from one population in one geography, and then that data set can be used on other people who do not volunteer, who do not want to be part of that, that data access, whether it's even DNA testing, for example. So your relative might be able to reveal some personal information about you, even though you did not consent to be, for that information to be known about you. But nevertheless, the point is that we are all interconnected. And so Ubuntu then tries to take this view that, well, if we're connected, then we need to sort of try to figure out a way in which we can all, live together, a way in which we can realize that our humanity is a direct function of the humanity of others. So therefore, when we affirm the rights of others, when we affirm the humanity of others, in that very process, we also affirm our own humanity. We also enrich our own humanity. However, if we go to the process of diminishing the rights of others, diminishing the humanity of others, then we also, in that very same process, diminish our own humanity, because it is impossible, when you oppress another being or another group or another population, in order to do so, you have to literally throw away your own humanity in that process in order to even do such a thing. And so therefore showing this connected link between how we relate to each other, and that there's a sort of a direct correlation, a direct interconnectedness that always exists. And so it is in our interest, it is in the interest of the oppressed, it is in the interest of the oppressors to try to work together, because nobody wins literally when rights are oppressed. We all either swim together or sink together. So being human in that context, to avoid a long answer, is to then, in the Ubuntu perspective, is to then realize and affirm these connections and allow other people to bring their uniqueness, to bring their stories into perspective, and then to find ways in how to accommodate that and to expand human rights as wide and as far as possible. Because by expanding those rights, we are also protecting our own rights, our own dignity, our own human worth.
I think that's really, really good, and worth to take the time to hear that greater elaboration on it, because it does set the scene for the context that many of us are working in. And Adelina, if I may call on you, you mentioned a lot about the consequences or the impacts of the top-down approach that still seems to be the norm as being experienced in regions such as South Asia. And I like you called for a more colorful approach, where you want to be partners and leaders and shift the discussions and leadership to where the disasters are. So I'd like to ask Adelina and the other speakers as well, what can an organization such as CDAC do to make this happen? This is not a new discussion. This has been a desire for many years in the humanitarian and development sector. So what can be done, if I can start with you, Adelina, by organizations such as CDAC to really make progress in this arena?
I think what we need to do is a transformative change, not just incremental, but transformative change. I like what Dragana said about perhaps introducing a new principle in the humanitarian world. I thought about it last night. What I thought was actually introducing a new international commitment where we are all those in the humanitarian world will be gearing towards technology for all, without string attached, without economic rent being applied. It's purely to help the affected countries and affected communities. That's one. Second, flip the top-down approach into bottom-up, and don't underestimate the power of the locally adapted homegrown solution, because they're more sustainable. They know the local context and needs, and we as the those that can we can serve as the one who bridge that regional organization like AHA Center or CDAC network. We can serve as the bridge. We can, for example, rather than telling them these are the kind of technology solution that you need, you help them to identify their problems. What kind of situation they want to achieve, because they may already have the solution themselves, and we just add some ingredients into that solution. And by doing that, then it's a participatory approach, right? It's not that difficult. Third, okay, I'll stop at that.
No, it's really good, but the concrete actions that are needed then, I mean, to flip, I think what Sabelo talked about, the discriminatory hierarchies that have become institutionalized, which he touched on in his opening keynote. For that to happen, there are tough choices to be made. There is power to be redistributed in terms of decision making, allocating budgets, and really following communities in disaster relief and partnering with them, truly partnering with them. If I may go to Ollie and also some of the panelists that joined you. Ollie, what are the concrete steps you think that can be taken to achieve this, and where do organizations like CDAC fit into it?
I'm really sorry, Paul. Could you just repeat the question there? You phased out for a sec.
I beg your pardon. No, and just in terms of really flipping the model, which is being called for and which is being emphasized this afternoon, in terms of shifting power and decision making to the countries that are experiencing disasters and emergencies, and really empowering them as partners and leaders in for instance, disaster response. Where communities are truly engaged and truly partners and leaders in their own, shaping their own destinies. What are the steps that need to be taken or that can be taken by the likes of international donors, international organizations, and organizations like CDAC to try and make this happen, to try and move the dial forward?
Thanks, Paul. I think I'm going to hand over to other panelists shortly, but I think from our side, one thing that we've been working on a lot is kind of how to move the dial on actually really making sure that affected people are involved in two-way dialogue, and that what Dragana was saying, this idea that consultation is enough, that's a sort of customer service approach to really profound issues about need and exclusion is not reduced to sort of atomized, individualized approaches where you get a case number and your complaint is dealt with at best. But just thinking about sort of how to profoundly change that so that it really is a conversation, and it really is a conversation that focuses on affected people themselves. Dragana, do you have anything to add on this?
Yes, a quick comment. On the tech side, what we oftentimes see is human-centered approach or user-centered approach, which works really well in private sector. This is a new space, and especially on this corner of tech and this humanitarian and innovation space, we rely so much on private sector for technology, for services, for maintenance, for skill sharing, right, and for funding, because we can't maintain programs like this for long term. what ends up happening is also we end up taking on some of these principles from private sector, from Silicon Valley as well, principles of disruption at all costs, of failing up, of moving fast and breaking stuff, and that's not how we operate. As for what needs to change, we need some very clear guidelines of how we're going to be working with private sector, because there are very few sort of frameworks to rely on here. One thing that came to mind, thinking of this is of what needs to change, is just thinking personally, as a researcher, as somebody who works in this field. I think we tend to take an approach of, oh my God, it's so annoying being in a room where somebody says, I want to find a way to use drones in humanitarian innovation, or I want to find a way to use blockchain. This sort of techno-solutionist approach, yes, it's annoying, but I think, personally, I would try to be more empathetic to both people who are really trying to make this work and get a little bit, enthusiastic or over-enthusiastic about tech. To explain this a bit better, because I feel like a lot of us who are working in civil society, myself included, tend to be a little bit critical without being helpful on providing solutions and approaches.
I hear a lot of the panelists calling for standards, systems. I think, Rob, you specifically signed off on that on the panel that was prior to this plenary. Can I put it to you that standards and systems have been around for decades? Are they failing? Why are we putting so much faith in a set of standards to really move forward? Will it not just create more dialogue, more discussion, and less action? Please, any of the panelists, but I want to put Rob on the spot for this first.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. I mean, my two initial points that come to mind is that, I mean, they're not failing for kind of keeping to the link of this conversation to the use of emerging technologies in the humanitarian sector. I mean, there's a lot of work on principles, but there's not much about how do you actually Sabelo mentioned the humanitarian initiative principles earlier, but how do you actually transform them into guidance? And there's not actually that much guidance, so it's quite hard to fail if there's an absence of something. So there's lots of minimum standards on various aspects of humanitarian work, but not so much on the actual implementation of new technologies. I mean, and that's why, to echo a little bit of what Dragana was saying, that's why often or not we kind of lean on the private sector who have those in places. You have the IAEE, you have, I could go on for 10 minutes listing different AI ethical frameworks that exist in the banking sector, the health sector, and so on. So I actually, to say what Ollie said, I actually think we need to go the next step. We need to advocate, like in particular to AI, the development of the systems needs to happen in-house. It needs to happen at national level, it needs to happen at local level. And that may be a big ask, but there's ways to support that. And then there's the support with capacity, or there's the, I mentioned earlier, I think again, it was Dragana about buying AI systems. I think the word they're getting cheaper. Okay, so if we're not gonna, if there's a kind of a technical gap in certain contexts where we can't develop the systems, we can certainly control how we procure the systems by controlling the procurement guidelines and ensuring that at least the guidelines meet minimum standards. Because at the end of the day, money talks. And if you say we're only going to implement a system if it meets A, B, and C, I can assure you that the developers behind that, if we can't develop it at national level or at local level, will adhere to the procurement guidelines that happen. So to answer your question, firstly, I genuinely do think there's a gap of interagency standards when it comes to the digital activities. Less so on drones, but definitely on a lot of the other ones. And then if we are going to lean on private partnerships, then we control the partnerships and we make it transparent. And then that way, we control the outcome without if we can't support the development.
So in many ways, it really is like we're striving for that accountability, which is very much the theme of the conference. And but to move from standards then to that accountability at the individual level, you know, where action is happening in the heat of the moment or in the heat of a disaster. So for instance, the whole area of consent, which was a common theme this morning. I know, like Dragana talked about just that sharing of a story, which is such a powerful symbol of trust, for instance, that happens when you're engaging with people affected by disasters in order ostensibly to try and provide better support, but without that sort of contract and that accountability to really follow up. And it goes all the way then to the algorithmic accountability, which we're focusing on in CDAC Public Forum, and the biometrics, for instance, which Emily mentioned. And I'm just wondering, how can we really make it, do we need to have some sort of a charter with the technology sector, for instance, who would largely be providing a lot of this, of the technology that we're talking about in terms of that accountability?
I mean, my question is, why do we have to lean on the sector? Why can't we aim, if we're talking about algorithmic accountability, why do we assume that the development of the algorithms have to happen out of house, should we say? Why can't they happen in-house? Whether a UN organization, NGO, national government, whatever, you know, we make that assumption that the power doesn't lie with us, that the development happens elsewhere. I mean, if the organization I work for, if we wanted to find an AI solution for whatever, the first thing we would do is, do we have that capacity in-house? And if not, can we recruit the right personnel? Because as Adelina happens, the people dealing with the problem, whoever that is, they know the problem better than anyone, and they will know the safeguards that need to happen. They need to know the protection that needs to happen, and all the accountability measures, the transparency measures. How do we communicate that both to the people we aim to serve, also to the people paying for the the donors, whoever. We're at the center of it, regardless of irrespective of the different stakeholders we all work for. So we should control that. And my priority is always lean towards developing it in-house firstly. And if we don't have that capacity to do so, then we ensure that we search for that partnership, that support in the best way we can, either if it's transparent partnerships or we control the procurement guidelines.
And what about the need to tap into local capacities? So for instance, I remember mapping a number of years ago technology accelerators in sub-Saharan Africa, and there was some 68 of them active at the time. Very few of them had ever been approached by humanitarian actors to collaborate together. There's that aspect, but there's also the aspect about being guided by the community itself in terms of the platforms you should be on, the platforms you need to really engage, if you're talking about engaging at scale in particular. So bringing bespoke, customized apps or solutions to a situation, a crisis situation, maybe just exacerbating it. It may be absolutely critical to partner with a technology provider whose platform is being used by the majority of the population, particularly if you're talking, in the hundreds of thousands or millions of people. I'd like to open up that point to the other colleagues as well. Is it really in-house solutions are the way forward?
Can I answer that with another question? Just to entertain this idea, should we really be using technology that we can't explain to people easily? I realize we can't explain electricity or internet very easily to folks, but if we're using complex solutions that we can't explain easily to our colleagues, I feel like there's a point to be made here that I don't hear often about creating new programs that or building on existing programs in a new way that we can't explain to people to get that kind of consent. Second point is, do we have that kind of capacity in-house? Because when it comes to especially open source technology on security side, this develops very quickly. We see this every week. There are updates. There are tools. especially around machine learning. How do we keep that? How do we keep those skills in house to keep up, I guess, with private sector to instead of going to rely on them constantly?
Yeah, I think touched on quite a key issue there and key questions, which I know will be addressed in more detail in the digital brainstorm later on this afternoon. Time is not elastic, unfortunately. At least I don't think so. But we have to move towards wrapping up this part of the forum right now. I'd like to thank all of the panelists for their time, for their insights from this afternoon. From Sabelo and Emily and Ollie and his panel. Thank you all so much. And we're going to take a break now in the forum, and we'll be back at 10 minutes past 2 UK time.